Thank you for joining today's Planning 101 Planning for the Environment webinar. Planning 101 is an educational initiative spearheaded by the City of Los Angeles' Department of City Planning in collaboration with the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. Since 2017, more than 1,200 community members have attended over 23 Planning 101 trainings. Past trainings have focused on our long-range policy efforts, including how we update community plans. We've also had trainings on our development review process, including how projects are reviewed by the Department of City Planning. Past trainings are available on our YouTube channel, which is linked via our website at www.planning.lacity.org for your convenience. This year's training will focus on the policies and regulations that guide environmental analysis, including CEQA review. We'd like to note that this presentation is not legal advice. The California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, is a complicated law subject with many exceptions and nuances that we cannot fully cover today. Our purpose today is to provide you with a general overview. Today, we are joined by Michelle Montenegro, a City Planning Associate, and City Planners Alan Como, Jenna Monterosa, and Milena Zazazdian. And I'm Dylan Tatig, a City Planning Associate and Community Liaison with the Department of City Planning, and your moderator for today's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics for today's webinar. There are two audio options. You can either choose to use your computer audio or listen in on your phone. If you choose to call in, please dial the phone number listed, area code 213-929-4232. If you are having any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar at area code 855-352-9002. You will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout today's presentation. You may ask questions at any point by simply typing in the questions box and clicking send. At the end of the presentation, we will take as many questions as we can during our question and answer session. In case we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, please follow up with your community liaison or any of the staff in today's presentation. Please note that today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available online at www.planning.lacity.org. Before we begin, please make sure you are able to access a handout we've made available via the webinar platform's Handouts tab. The sheet is titled the CEQA Flowchart. We will be referencing this chart throughout today's presentation. Today's training will cover the following topics. First, we'd like to define what planning for the environment means to help set the context. Then, we will discuss the specific role of the Los Angeles Department of City Planning. Next, we will cover how the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA, guides our policy and project considerations. We will also go over the role of the public and how to get involved in the CEQA process. Our final section will go over what else is under the purview of the department and the city that speaks to our concerted efforts on environmental policy, including other initiatives that advance our work around sustainability goals. We will conclude by putting our knowledge to the test and going over some planning scenarios to demonstrate how it all comes together before we get into the question and answer session. I'd like to now turn it over to Michelle Montenegro to begin our presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Montenegro, and I'm one of the staff members on the Southwest Valley Community Plan Update team. As Dylan said, we're going to talk about planning for the environment today. But before we get into what the Department of City Planning does, we're going to define what it is. It's really focused on the protection, management, and conservation of our environment, and this includes everything from climate change to natural and energy resources. In the past, the field has really focused on wilderness preservation, but as we move further into the interaction between the natural and built environment, we're looking at how cities can better address the impacts of this development and really what that interaction and interface looks like. If we look at every level of environmental planning in terms of what we do in the short term, in terms of development, as well as the long term in terms of policies. So if we look at environmental planning, it really affects the day-to-day. It determines how much water we conserve. It determines how we deal with climate change. And so moving forward, we have to keep that in mind. We focus on the local level, but we also focus on the federal and state branches of each government and what role they have to play with environmental planning. Before we get into that topic, let's talk a little bit more about the city of LA. Los Angeles is a diversity of almost 470 square miles. And so we can see that its diversity is really reflected not only in the built environment, but also its peoples and its communities and neighborhoods. We have everywhere from urban areas and regional centers, such as like Warner Center and downtown. We have semi-rural neighborhoods, equestrian neighborhoods in Chatsworth and Porter Ranch. And then we have our really strong single-family neighborhoods that collectively make up the large portions of Los Angeles. So really what we're trying to do is meet the needs and wants of each community, but do that in ways that really address sustainability goals and ensure that those goals are complemented with social and economic goals as well. So we recognize that whatever we do in the environment and planning efforts, we have to do it with sensitivity because that human activity is really interacting with what we do in terms of our decision making on a daily basis. Now that we looked at the diversity of the built environment, we're going to look at the natural environment. Our natural environment is equally diverse. It has everything from our mountainous Santa Monica Mountains to the hillsides of our west side and West Valley to beaches and coastal areas such as Venice. And we have the traversing LA River that covers most of the city of LA. There are many unaltered areas that are virtually untouched, that have an expansive ecosystem that includes both flora and fauna and are home to endangered species. You may be surprised that we're one of the two major cities in the world that have a famous resident, with ours being P22 Mountain Lion and the other being the city of Mumbai, India. We're also one of 20 biodiversity hotspots in the world, so that's very exciting, and that's due to our semi-arid climate. So here in the city of LA, we have a geography that's really met through all types of natural features. Some may be man-made, but still have their ecosystem, such as the Sepulveda Basin and the LA River. But as we understand that we have beautiful natural features here in the city of LA, we also have to develop next to sensitive areas such as fire hazard areas, earthquake faults, flood zones, oil hazards, and high wind areas. So the challenges that come with planning in an environment that's such a diverse environment and home to over 4 million residents is really shown on our everyday basis. So looking at our challenges and opportunities, we understand that environmental planning is looking beyond just biodiversity and wildlife conservation, but also the more sensitive topics such as environmental justice, public health, climate change, and other sensitivities that may come from adjacency between the built and the natural environment. It's not to say that we don't have our challenges here in LA, but we are one of the major cities that are taking steps to addressing these types of issues. So we understand that a major goal of the city as we develop is really sustainable growth. And we do that through efficient land use planning, which means that we may start locating housing near transit as a major goal, as well as multimodal transportation options that allow options that are both accessible and equitable for all of Angelinos here. But on top of that, we have changing conditions in the city as well as the rest of the world. So as we continue these efforts in both development and long-range planning, we understand that this has to be done in a holistic kind of way. One of the efforts that we're doing here is through the Community Planning Bureau. We have 35 community plans in the entire city, which makes up our land use element of the general plan. Right now, we are collectively updating 16 of those 35 community plans, which makes out about 40% of the 470 square miles of the city of Los Angeles. So these plans are really looking at applying citywide goals such as sustainable growth at a local and neighborhood type of level to ensure that whatever goal that we're applying to geography, it's done in a way where we're doing it with public input. We're doing it with sensitivity to understand our neighborhoods and our communities to ensure that we're listening back in a type of feedback loop that's really sensitive to what we do. In addition, we also have other elements of the general plan, such as the Healthy Plan for LA. This plan is actually a very interesting one because it looks at those deeper issues such as social health and equity on a neighborhood level and a citywide level. So it goes anywhere from looking at food systems to ensuring that all Angelinos have access to healthy food networks, to looking at healthcare accessibilities and accessibility to open space and recreation. So before we look at the localized level of environmental planning, we're going to take a look at what the federal level has been doing in terms of environmental planning since the 1960s. In 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act, commonly referred to NEPA, was enacted. And then the Clean Air Act followed in 1970, and what we know now as the Clean Water Act followed in 1972. Further, in 1973, Endangered Species Act was adopted as well. In 1980s, Congress further strengthened these environmental protection laws through amendments to previous legislation. In 2016, the Paris Climate Accords looked at reducing greenhouse emissions throughout the world collectively through the help of different countries and states. Now that we looked at the regulatory context for the federal government, we're going to look more into the state of California. In 1953, planning and zoning laws really took into effect that established how we do land use. In 1965 is the adoption and requirement of the general plan. The general plan is really a blueprint for each city to meet their goals and needs. So in terms of environmental sustainability, the general plan is really a vehicle to understanding what those policies are. There are certain events in 1960s and 1970s that really brought about social movements that looked at enhancing environmental planning, and this includes the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969. It's around this time that CEQA was also enacted, and we can dedicate later time in this presentation to that. 1972, the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act was established to provide protection from existing active faults throughout the state. And in 1991, the California EPA was established as well. The EPA has three components as of right now: the Air Resources Board, the ARB, which reduces air pollution and diesel exhaust, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, DPR, which ensures safe use of pesticides, the Department of Resources, Recycling and Recovery, CalRecycle, which has helped the state achieve the highest waste reduction, recycling, and reuse goals in the nation. In 2006, the California Global Warming Solutions, what we know now as AB 32, was adopted to explore how we can address greenhouse gas emission reductions. AB 32 is really the first impetus for the first mandatory green building standards. In 2008, with the California Senate Bill of 375, the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act outlined growth strategies that would better integrate how we do regional land use and transportation planning to assist in meeting these greenhouse goals. SB 375 also provided CEQA streamlining, which allowed benefits for projects that were located in transit priority areas. But we will highlight that more in the presentation. More recently, the state has gone beyond these initial legislation for environmental planning to look at issues such as equity and justice to ensure that climate change, energy, and wildfires are being addressed. As you can tell, planning regulations have been incrementally changing throughout the decades. This may be through culture, the political climate, current events such as legislation, and other changes that may inform what environmental planning means for now and the future. So the implementation of federal and state policies that really plan for the environment affects both our long-term goals and policies, as well as the immediate development that's being planned for and reviewed. But before we get into the secret review process that the Department of City Planning does, I want to touch briefly on existing regulations such as building codes that oftentimes are informed by these federal and state policies. So looking at the California Building Code, we understand that before new development proposals come in, building codes are really the first defense of how we protect and ensure the health and safety of the community. There is no national standard for building code, but these building codes are entirely left up to the discretion of states. So we have to understand that California has its own building code that may be different from other states. The California Building Code, also known as Title 24, is what we use, and it's based on international building codes, standards that have been adopted to meet California conditions, as well as standards passed by the legislator to address specific concerns to California. In 2008, California became the first state in the US to establish green building codes, demonstrating once again that we are the leaders in environmental planning. In California, building standards are updated periodically to implement policies that are designed to protect the environment. An example of this is state's energy standards, which came into effect in 2017. As a result, new homes today must be constructed to higher energy standards, utilizing 20% less energy for lighting, heating, cooling, and ventilation compared to those homes that were built in 2013. So moving on to the LA Building Code and what that means for environmental planning, we go further to attain consistency with state standards in efforts to reduce buildings' energy and water use, reduce waste, and reduce our carbon footprint. I'm just going to read a list of what it applies to. It applies to all new buildings, both residential and non-residential, all additions, both residential and non-residential, all building alterations valued at $200,000 or more, and residential alterations that increase the building capacity. The Green Building Code requirements include aspects of planning and design, which includes stormwater drainage, retention, pollution prevention, energy efficiency, water efficiency and conservation, material conservation, resource efficiency, which includes our diversion for construction-related waste, and environmental quality, which includes pollutant control of finishing materials like aerosol paints. So as we move on, we have to remember that these standards are being applied to all building permits that are being sought in the city of Los Angeles. Now that we covered a brief background on the field of planning and environmental planning and looked at the federal, state, and local context, we're going to discuss the role of city and the Department of City Planning, then followed by CEQA. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Alan Como. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Alan Como. I'm a city planner working on projects in South Los Angeles. We've covered a brief background on the field of planning for the environment that included a look at the federal, state, and local context focused on building codes. Next, we will discuss the role of the city and the Department of City Planning, followed by CEQA. The Department of City Planning is organized into 4 major bureaus. Citywide Planning manages the long-range planning efforts for the department, setting policy goals and objectives that inform the neighborhood-level work. Community Planning oversees the policy updates to the city's community plans, which inform local zoning decisions and the types of uses that are permitted. Project Planning supervises the review of development within planning's authority, processing project applications, and administering environmental review. Resource Management provides the technical, administrative, and financial services that are critical to the overall success of the entire department. The department's core mission includes planning for a healthy and sustainable future, and as such, most of its activities and efforts are geared towards the goals of efficient land use planning and preparing the city for changing conditions. Before we dive deeper into the role of the Department of City Planning, we would first like to clarify the types of projects under our purview. Essentially, we'd like to describe the differences between 2 types of projects, by right and discretionary. Before anyone can begin construction within the city or in your neighborhood, their first stop is typically at the public counter at one of our development services centers. Proposed development projects are generally evaluated based on project type and location to determine what kind of review is required prior to receiving a building permit. This process begins with the Department of Building and Safety with a request for a building permit. It is helpful to remember that Building and Safety is our city's clearinghouse for reviewing and signing off on building code requirements and permits. Projects that conform with zoning requirements and don't otherwise require discretionary entitlements proceed through what we refer to as by right or a ministerial process. These projects can proceed with requesting a building permit without any prior planning entitlement approvals. While these projects may require sign-offs from various city departments, including the planning department, it involves a limited review process for compliance with all building and zoning standards. While a by right project is reviewed for conformity with our zoning code, a discretionary project requires the exercise of judgment before the city can decide to approve or disapprove a project. These projects are reviewed by the planning department. The spectrum of projects that may require discretionary review can include requests for slight modifications or legislative changes to the zoning code, zoning changes to allow for a different use of the land, or sometimes the review for consistency with an overlay or a specific plan. Similar to by right projects, the first stop is almost always the public counter at one of our development services centers where applications are filed. Those of you who were at last year's Planning 101 will remember what this process entails, having spent a considerable amount of time going into the level of detail as to what planners consider during the discretionary review process. That presentation is available online for those of you who may have missed it. For the purposes of today's presentation, If the project is approved, it is referred to the Department of Building Safety and follows the rest of the process previously described prior to receiving their building permits. We want to emphasize the key differences between a by right project and a discretionary project because the next section of our presentation will focus on the environmental review required for discretionary projects, per the California Environmental Quality Act, commonly known as CEQA. For this next section, please look in the Handouts tab in the GoToWebinar platform for the handout I'll be referring to. As we already discussed, CEQA was enacted by the state of California in 1970 to establish statewide regulations for the environmental review of discretionary projects. Environmental documents that result from the CEQA process are intended to serve as informational documents for both the public and decision makers. The purpose of CEQA is to identify and disclose any potential and significant environmental impacts and to avoid or mitigate those impacts when possible or feasible. CEQA applies to all discretionary projects, including revisions to our general plan and community plans, as well as certain proposed ordinances. Under CEQA, projects are defined as actions or activities that may cause a direct or reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change in the environment. By the environment, we are referring to the physical conditions which exist within the area which will be affected by a proposed project. This could include land, air, water, minerals, flora, fauna, noise, objects of historic value, aesthetics, etc. CEQA covers both the natural and man-made conditions. CEQA is a state law. Therefore, it is largely a product of the state legislature, state agencies like the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. CEQA is also updated as a result of court decisions, such as the Friends of Mammoth versus the Board of Supervisors in 1972, which was a landmark case that first extended the application of CEQA to private development. Before this court decision, CEQA only applied to public projects. A more recent court decision is California Building Industry Association versus Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which reaffirmed how CEQA looked at a project's impacts on the environment, rather than the existing environment's impact on a proposed project. Because CEQA is a self-executing statute, local jurisdictions are entrusted with compliance with CEQA, meaning that we as a city are charged with preparing the necessary documents to demonstrate compliance with CEQA. Given that a primary goal of CEQA is public disclosure, you all play an important role throughout the CEQA environmental review process. Under CEQA, there are essentially four main outcomes from the review process. Exemptions are where the state says that the project has less than a significant impact on the environment. Negative declarations are where the lead agency finds that the project has no potential significant impacts. Mitigated negative declarations are where the lead agency finds the project has no potential significant impacts with mitigation imposed. Or environmental impact reports where the lead agency finds that the project has potentially significant impacts that cannot be mitigated to a less than significant level. For each of these, there are corresponding documents required that contain analysis and reasoning to demonstrate why it falls under the specified categories. Over the next few slides, we will go over these processes. Generally speaking, the CEQA review process includes a preliminary review, preparation of the appropriate CEQA documents, and a decision-making phase. Now, let's dive deeper into exemptions. Exemptions can only be used for projects that fit into a set of clearly defined conditions. There are two types, statutory and categorical. Statutory exemptions include projects that are specifically excluded from CEQA consideration as defined by the state legislature. For example, the Sustainable Communities Project exemption otherwise abbreviated SCPE, was established as a result of passage of Senate Bill 375. SB 375 was enacted to better coordinate land use and transportation planning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by encouraging higher density and infill development in areas located near transit. For this example, to be found statutorily exempt, a project must qualify as a transit priority project and be declared to be a sustainable communities project. Transit priority projects must generally be consistent with the general land use designation, density, building, intensity, and policies as outlined by our local metropolitan planning organization. The Southern California Association of Governments is the metropolitan planning organization for Los Angeles. Projects must also meet certain criteria related to minimum density, residential uses, and distances from major transit stop or high-quality transit corridors. Projects can only be declared sustainable community projects if they meet certain environmental, land use, and public benefits criteria as outlined in the California Public Resources Code. We are taking the time to explain the depth of this exemption to demonstrate that the word exemption can be somewhat misleading. Some exempt projects must still undergo a rigorous environmental review process. Moving on to categorical exemptions. These are given to projects that the California Secretary of the Resources Agency has determined to not have significant impacts on the environment. There are 33 classes of such projects. One example is Class 32, which is available for infill development located in an urban area. To qualify, a project must meet all of the following criteria. The project site must be 5 acres or less in size. The project must be consistent with the general plan or community plan and zoning requirements. The project site has no value as a habitat for endangered, rare, or threatened species. Approval of the project would not result in any significant impacts relating to traffic, noise, air quality, or water quality, and that the site can adequately be served by all required utilities and public services. Other commonly used categorical exemptions include Class 1, which may include the minor alteration of an existing facility, and Class 3, which may include new construction of small structures. Unlike statutory exemptions, categorical exemptions must be further reviewed to ensure that a particular project doesn't trigger an exception that would disqualify a project from being categorically exempt under CEQA. These exceptions include factors that address a project's location in a sensitive environment, significant cumulative impacts from successive projects in the same location of the same type, identifiable unusual circumstances, potential impacts to a state-designated scenic highway, a project's location within a hazardous waste site listed under state law, or a project's significant impact to a historical resource. On this slide, you will see an enlarged and isolated version of outcomes A and B from your handout. This is the general process that a project might follow if it were to qualify for an exemption. While the process might look shorter on this handout, projects do undergo a process of review per CEQA to ensure that a project qualifies for an exemption. An initial study must be prepared if a project is not exempt, or if it is exempt but one of the exceptions apply. An initial study is the preliminary analysis that is prepared to determine if a proposed project may have a significant impact on the environment. On your handout, you will see that processes labeled C, D, and E all begin with an initial study. Respectively, the initial study determines if a project will result in a negative declaration, a mitigated negative declaration, or an environmental impact report. As listed on this slide, there are 20 impact categories that we look at as a part of the initial study, including aesthetics, air quality, noise, population and housing, cultural resources, and public services as examples. For each impact category, we want to answer a series of questions to determine if, for that category, there is a potentially significant impact on the environment, a less than significant impact if mitigation is incorporated, a less than significant impact, or no impact at all. These questions include findings and evidence to support the city's analysis. Explanations will typically identify the criteria used to evaluate each question and the mitigation measure identified to mitigate or reduce the impact to a less than significant level. A significant impact is defined as substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in any of the physical conditions within the area affected by the project, including land, air, water, minerals, flora, fauna, ambient noise, and objects of historic or aesthetic significance. A social or economic change by itself is not considered to be a significant effect on the environment. The threshold of significance defines the level of impact above which we will consider impacts to be significant and below which we will consider impacts to be less than significant. An appendix of the state CEQA guidelines, known as Appendix G, now serves as our city's current thresholds. As mentioned, the state has made major revisions to CEQA. They added 2 new impact categories, energy and wildfire, and additionally, the transportation impact category will also be undergoing a major revision. Rather than measuring impacts by the traffic congestion and trip delay experienced by drivers, commonly referred to as LOS or level of service, this new metric instead considers the amount of overall miles vehicles travel, VMT or vehicle miles traveled, with the focus of moving to vehicle emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, a mitigated negative declaration is prepared when project revisions, otherwise known as mitigation measures, are required in order to eliminate or reduce adverse effects on the environment to a less than significant level. Negative declarations, or NDs, and mitigated negative declarations, or MNDs, include a brief description of the project, a finding that the project will not have a significant effect on the environment, a copy of the initial study documenting reasons to support the finding, and in the case of mitigated negative declarations, they will contain mitigation measures to avoid potentially significant effects. These mitigation measures must describe feasible actions that the project can make. They must be enforceable. They must have a nexus or connection between the mitigation and a legitimate government interest, and they must be roughly proportional to the impacts on the environment. When mitigation measures have been identified to reduce environmental impacts to a less than significant level, they are adopted by the decision maker as a requirement for the project through conditions of approval. In order to ensure that mitigation is implemented, a mitigation monitoring program, or MMP, is adopted with a mitigated negative declaration and included as a condition of approval with the associated project approval. Within an adopted MMP, mitigation measures are listed by impact categories and specifically call out the phase of the project they correspond to. They also detail which agency will enforce the measure, how often they will monitor it, and how the agency will demonstrate compliance. On this slide, you will see an enlarged and isolated version of Outcome C from your handout. This is the general process that a project with a negative declaration might follow. It begins with the preparation of an initial study and the asking of the question, does the project have any potentially significant impacts on the environment? If the answer is no, we prepare an ND. We publish a notice of intent to adopt for public review, and then we adopt the negative declaration if the project is approved. And finally, it ends with filing the notice of determination with the county clerk. On this slide, you will see an enlarged and isolated version of outcome D from your handout. This is the general process that a project with a mitigated negative declaration might follow. As you can see, the process for a negative declaration and a mitigated negative declaration are very similar. Moving forward, let's discuss environmental impact reports. After completing the initial study, if a project's effects can't be reduced to a less than significant level, an environmental impact report or EIR is prepared. An EIR informs the public and decision makers of the significant environmental impacts of a project, the possible ways to minimize those effects, and the reasonable alternatives to the project. If a project is deemed to have significant environmental impacts after the identification of all feasible mitigation measures, the lead agency must prepare a statement of overriding considerations to explain why further mitigation measures are not feasible and why approval of a project with significant but unavoidable impacts is warranted. This statement will reflect the ultimate balancing of competing benefits for the project, such as economic or social benefits against its potential significant effects on the environment. For this presentation, we are focusing on project EIRs that the planning department processes. However, the department who may prepare and certify an EIR for the City of Los Angeles could also be other city departments, like, for example, the Bureau of Engineering. Like MNDs, any identified mitigation would be incorporated into a MMP and presented to the decision maker to consider alongside the project's entitlements. One thing that we'd like to note here is that while the EIR process involves more steps for public involvement, the environmental analysis is similar, although generally more extensive, to what is found in many initial studies that result in mitigated negative declarations. On this slide, you will see an enlarged and isolated version of outcome E from your handout. The first step in preparing an EIR is issuing a notice of preparation, once it has been determined that an EIR is required for a project. The notice of preparation launches a scoping period which allows the public to comment on the appropriate scope and content for the EIR. The scoping period is helpful in identifying the range of actions, alternatives, mitigation measures, and significant effects to be analyzed for a project. A scoping meeting is an optional meeting that may be held for the purpose of providing an additional forum for public to submit their comments. This is usually for projects of regional significance, including larger policy proposals like a community plan update. Once the scoping period ends, a draft environmental impact report is prepared for public comment. The draft is then released for public comment, and CEQA requires either a 30 or a 45-day comment period. Anything beyond that period is voluntary. Comments are then reviewed, and responses to all comments are prepared. The purpose of responding to comments received on a draft EIR is to address the significant environmental issues raised from public agencies and members of the public. The city is not required in the EIR to respond to late comments or to comments that do not raise significant environmental issues. In reviewing EIRs, members of the public should explain the basis of their comments and should submit supporting evidence. The level of detail in responses will generally correspond to the level of details in the comment. Sometimes responses to comments result in a revision to the draft EIR. Responses to comments, as well as any revisions, clarifications, and corrections of a draft EIR and the mitigation monitoring program are incorporated into what is referred to as a project's final EIR. Unless significant revisions are needed, the final EIR is prepared and the city sends a notification about its availability. Typically, this notice will coincide with the mail-out of a hearing notice for the project's discretionary actions. Next, my colleague, Jenna Monterosa, will cover the role of the public and beyond CEQA topics.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Monterosa, and I'm a city planner with our External Affairs Division. So we often receive questions from the public asking about best practices when it comes to providing public comments on environmental documents. As we've discussed, CEQA is a public disclosure law, and there are many ways and many times throughout the CEQA process where the public is notified or provided with an opportunity to provide direct input. Taking a look at your handout, you'll notice that there are a lot of different acronyms. And most of these acronyms refer to the types of notices we issue to ensure that the public remains informed about the process. The types of notices are pretty self-explanatory, but we've listed the 6 that pertain specifically to CEQA and that you'll most often see in your interactions with the CEQA process. So on your screen, you'll see notice of intent, notice of preparation, there's a notice of completion, there's a notice of availability, a notice of exemption, and finally, a notice of determination. We'd like to first say that public comments are welcome throughout the entire project review process. However, today we will highlight 2 specific examples from the EIR process. So beginning with the scoping period that we've talked about previously, the scoping period begins when we issue a notice of preparation or an NOP. At this time, we are seeking comments that could help inform the appropriate scope and content of the proposed draft EIR. In this example, a commenter is asking that the EIR for this project consider the design and need for open space by examining if the area is currently underserved for parks. So the issue, when it was received, was categorized under the public services impact category of the draft EIR. And in response, the lead agency used metrics to analyze park demand, park availability, and plans for future parks. The next comment on your screen is an example of a comment that we would receive during a draft EIR comment period. So a minimum 30-day public comment period begins after a draft EIR is published in order to seek public comments. During this period, the comments should specifically respond to the analysis found in the draft EIR and point out any inconsistencies or identify any issues with the existing analysis. So in the example, you'll see that a commenter is asserting that the plan's impact on schools was analyzed using outdated enrollment numbers, and the new population allowed in the proposed plan would result in over-enrollment as the local schools do not have plans to increase enrollment capacity. This comment discusses specific concerns with the environmental analysis that was prepared in the draft EIR and stated that it could be improved by providing school enrollment data that would refute what was analyzed in the EIR. The city's response to this comment was to prepare a 5-page master response to comprehensively address concerns about school capacity. And in their response, the school provided school data directly from LAUSD, in which they discussed LAUSD's practices regarding school boundaries, charter school establishment, and facilities and enrollment planning. So other good examples or techniques for comments that we receive on environmental review would be things like proposing new or modified mitigation measures that would address potential impacts that were identified in the EIR. An example of this would be suggesting that a driveway be relocated to reduce pedestrian and bike conflicts. Another good example of a comment that we might receive during this period is a request for a clarification and information. So an example of this would be a question such as, does this school information include charter schools? So keep in mind that the environmental review process is only one way in which we analyze projects. The project will also undergo a development review process associated with the project's requested entitlements. We briefly alluded to the development review process when we explained the differences between by right projects and discretionary projects. This concurrent review for discretionary projects includes looking at development standards such as use, height, setbacks, parking, density, or floor area ratio. You'll note that for steps C, D, and E, each respective environmental review document undergoes an adoption or certification. To learn more about decision making, we'd like to once more make a plug to our YouTube channel, where you'll find information more in depth about the city's land use decision-making process. So as you can see, CEQA is an important planning tool for helping cities determine potential environmental impacts associated with development projects or long-term policies. It also plays an important role in ensuring that information is disclosed to the public and to decision makers in a way that is consistently applied across the board. However, CEQA alone is not intended to regulate every aspect of a project's potential impact on the environment. That is why cities also rely on a web of other regulations and policies to direct growth in a sustainable manner with the fewest amount of environmental and/or public health impacts. So beyond the work that we've talked about at the state level, our city has and continues to establish policies and regulations that speak to our city's unique diversity and evolving needs. Last month, Mayor Garcetti released details of the Los Angeles Green New Deal. This plan incorporates other past key citywide plans which address issues of environmental justice, resiliency, sustainability, and even green jobs. The plan sets aggressive goals for the city's sustainable future. It tackles climate change with accelerated targets and sets LA on a course to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. The plan also aims to zero out LA's main sources of harmful emissions, including buildings, transportation, electricity, and trash. In addition, the LA City Council is also working to put forward additional motions to advance this work. Another ongoing citywide effort is the revitalization of the Los Angeles River. The LA River flows 51 miles through some of the most diverse communities in Southern California. It stretches through 32 miles within the city of Los Angeles alone. So the city is working towards restoring the river's ecological function and transforming it into an amenity connecting communities along the river. So moving beyond citywide efforts, individual city departments also continue to plan and implement goals and strategies that protect our environment. Taking a look at the Department of Building and Safety, for example, as we discussed, they implement the Green Building Code. Other things they do include reviewing high-rise and seismic retrofits and excavations that occur in or near fault and liquefaction zones. They also administer the city's methane code, which sets forth minimum requirements for the control of naturally occurring methane gas. So moving on, taking a look at the Port of LA. The Port of Los Angeles is responsible for implementing a slew of anti-air pollution strategies, including the Green Truck Program, vessel pollution reduction programs, and advanced newer technologies such as employing the world's first hybrid tugboat. Next, the Department of Water and Power. What they do is implement highly aggressive strategies for water and energy conservation, and their water conservation requirements have led to many positive outcomes. For example, at 102 gallons per day, LA has one of the lowest water use per capita levels of any major US city, and as a total, water use today is about the same as it was in the 1970s, despite a population increase of over 1 million people. And under the umbrella of the Department of Public Works, the Bureau of Sanitation implements our city's low-impact development ordinance, which focuses on treating stormwater runoff at the source before it finds itself in our storm drains, where it will return into the ocean in an untreated state. The Bureau of Sanitation also recently worked on the newly adopted Plastic Straws on Request ordinance, which was just adopted on this year's Earth Day in April. The fire department implements protections outlined in our city's fire code and also created programs like the Red Flag Restricted Parking Program, which focuses to increase public safety in hillside areas, especially where access is of particular concern. So while this is not a comprehensive list, we wanted to provide you with a citywide perspective before we focus on some of the more innovative work that the Department of City Planning is spearheading. So outside of the scope of CEQA review, the Department of City Planning consistently works to plan for the environment in various capacities. You'll see on the screen we've listed a number of recent ordinances that our department has worked on to have adopted. These ordinances all contribute to planning for and protecting the environment in their own ways. Taking a look first at our Farmers Market Ordinance. This ordinance was adopted in 2018 and allows for farmers markets to occur in residential zones. It also streamlines the approval process for farmers markets to occur in other zones. And so in its own way, this ordinance plans for our city's environment because it allows local communities to benefit from the availability of fresh and healthy produce. The city's Cleanup Greenup ordinance was adopted in 2016 and addresses both public health and economic well-being. The Cleanup Greenup ordinance grew out of a grassroots effort in 3 of LA's toxic hotspot neighborhoods, where residents live with intense concentrations of local pollution. People who live in these communities are at a higher risk of cancer, heart disease, and other chronic afflictions due to pollution. The ordinance addresses the cumulative health impacts of industrial incompatible land uses that are adjacent to homes, schools, parks, and other sensitive users in communities that are most impacted from an overconcentration of industrial pollution sources. And so what once started with community involvement has now developed into an ordinance that is part of our zoning code. The Cleanup Greenup ordinance benefits both residents and the business community through coordinated inspections and protective health standards for new and expanded industrial operations. It also includes a citywide provision that allows the City of Los Angeles to further restrict the expansion of oil refinery operations by requiring a health impact assessment and a conditional use permit, which is a discretionary action and would require CEQA. The Cleanup Greenup ordinance also contains building code measures that require mandatory air filters in all new residential units within 1,000 feet of a freeway. Another example is our city's solar ordinance, which makes it easier for folks to build structures that support solar energy systems found throughout the city. The ordinance derived from a citywide push to add solar power to the grid. What it does is it provides exceptions for structures that solely support solar systems, such as reductions in parking requirements. And now taking a look at current department efforts. Planning recently launched a wildlife pilot study to draft development guidelines and regulations that balance low-density residential hillside areas within the presence of natural lands where unique wildlife habitat exists. Moving forward, habitat connectivity and wildlife mobility will be studied in a pilot area that includes the Santa Monica Mountains between the 405 and 101 freeways. This effort seeks to find a balance between private property development and habitat areas vital for wildlife connectivity. Planning for habitat preservation and wildlife connectivity helps to achieve biodiversity goals and protects the unique ecosystems within Los Angeles. The department is also working to update our citywide design guidelines in an effort to elevate the design quality of the public realm and create a more vibrant, livable, walkable, and sustainable Los Angeles. The guidelines will focus on 3 design approaches: pedestrian first, 360 design, and climate adapted design, which responds to LA's Mediterranean climate, our rapidly changing climate conditions, and also draws upon some of the latest advancements in climate adapted designs. Our department is also working on the adoption of what is referred to as the collection bin ordinance. This ordinance establishes regulations for permitting, placement, and maintenance requirements for owners and operators. Currently, many collection bins found throughout the city are not properly maintained and have resulted in the overflow of items, illegal dumping of trash, and the accumulation of toxic materials, which poses dangers to public health and safety. For more information on these or any other pending ordinances our department is handling, we encourage you to visit our department's website at planning.lacity.org. Another way our department plans for the environment is through the update of our general plan. The general plan is our comprehensive plan for the city, which frames an overarching vision for the type of city we aspire to be and provides guidelines on how the city prepares for and responds to change, and also frames how we'd like to grow. Walkability is a function of compactness and density. Attention to streetscape and public spaces is key in creating desirable places to live. Neighborhoods that keep this in mind are more likely to support efficient transit systems, placing the character and function of each neighborhood properly within its regional setting. This approach to planning from the neighborhood to the regional level is often referred to as smart growth. In the recently adopted South Los Angeles Community Plan, one goal that addresses sustainability is Goal 11 of the Land Use section, which encourages green development that promotes an ecologically sustainable community and reduces greenhouse gases. A policy that supports this goal encourages the use of native and drought-tolerant plants in all new development to conserve water use. Additional examples found within the plan include goals that call for developing land use and development strategies that encourage walking and bicycling. Another example is calling for future industrial land uses to provide job opportunities for the community while minimizing negative environmental and visual impacts to the community. Community plans are primarily implemented by our zoning code. Goals and policies ultimately inform the appropriate zone changes that may occur during the update of a community plan. These zone changes, amongst other policy-level decisions the city makes, is ultimately how a project becomes by right. We highlight this point to stress the importance of getting involved in the community plan update process in your neighborhood. It is an appropriate time to address land use concerns or opportunities that you've identified in your community to improve and strengthen your vision for a sustainable future.
Over the next few slides, we will present you with planning scenarios, and we will utilize the poll feature of this webinar to receive your input about how the project may be subject to environmental review. If you have a question about one of the scenarios, please use the questions box and we can attempt to answer it. As a note, these scenarios have been generalized for the purposes of this activity.
Okay, for the first scenario, a business owner is looking to make facade improvements on their storefront on a commercial corridor. They go to the Development Services Center, where they are directed to the Department of Building and Safety to apply for the necessary permits. So the question is what kind of review process would this project undergo? Take some time to navigate over to the poll section and select one of the answers that you think best applies. We'll give you some time to do that. So again, think back at this time, some of the things that we've covered already so far about the types of reviews, whether it's discretionary or not discretionary, by right is what we would call that. All right. We're going to go ahead and close the poll. It looks like most of you have weighed in on your answer, and vast majority of you have said that this is not a project under CEQA. And that is correct. This project is by right because it is consistent with zoning regulations and does not require discretionary review due to its location and scope. So because it's by right, the project would not require a formal CEQA review. However, in order to acquire the necessary building permits, the project would require sign-offs from various departments, including the Department of Building and Safety, and it would be checked against the local Los Angeles Green Building Code, which was developed to attain consistency with state standards and further reduce buildings' energy, water use, reduce waste, and reduce their carbon footprint. So Green Building Code requirements include aspects of planning and design, energy efficiency, water efficiency, conservation, material conservation, and resource efficiency. So these standards are universally applied to projects seeking building permit within Los Angeles. Okay, so let's move on to the second scenario now. So this one, an applicant is seeking to subdivide their property to build 30 small lot homes. So go ahead and weigh in on the poll and indicate there what you think, what type of review process you think this might need to undergo. For those of you who may not be familiar with small lot developments, it's a type of subdivision of land to divide land into lots that are normally a little bit smaller than some of the typical lots in the city of Los Angeles. Okay, so we're going to give a couple more seconds here for people to answer in on the poll. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. So it looks like there's kind of a wide variety of answer here. I would say most people are indicating an environmental impact report, and the rest is broken down pretty evenly there between mitigated negative declaration and a categorical exemption. And again, as we stated, the scenarios here, we kept some of the details fairly general by nature. But this, for our scenario, this could be well, this is a discretionary project due to its request to subdivide the property, and it will require review and approval from the planning department. So it's discretionary and not by right. As a discretionary case, this project is subject to CEQA. Now, on our example here, we just wanted to highlight that one possible one possible review would be under categorical exemption class 32, which is for infill development. And so that has some qualifications for it. For example, the project site must be 5 acres or less in size, The project must be consistent with the general plan and zoning requirements. That one of the criteria is that the project has no value as a habitat for endangered, rare, or threatened species. Another criteria is that the approval of the project would not result in any significant effects relating to traffic, noise, air quality, and water quality, and that the site can adequately be served by all required utilities and public services. So we didn't provide any details about how large the site is or anything like that, but what we wanted to highlight is that there are a wide variety of projects that could possibly fit into a Class 32 exemption. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other answers that many of you chose, the MND or EIR process, are incorrect. We just wanted to highlight something that could possibly qualify as a Class 32 exemption. Okay, we're going to move on to the third scenario now.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So for the third scenario, we're going to start with the description. A property owner is seeking to construct a mixed-use building containing 140 residential units and 6,700 square feet of ground floor commercial space. The project is requesting more floor area than the zoning for the property currently allows. So the question is, what kind of environmental review process would this project undergo? So again, going back to the scenario, this is a much larger project in comparison to the previous examples. You have 140 residential units, and this one also has a commercial space component, over 6,700 square feet of ground floor commercial space. And the project is seeking to allow for more floor area than the zoning for the property currently allows. So we'll go to our poll results. It looks like the majority of folks selected that the project would undergo an environmental impact report. So that could be the situation, but in this scenario, the project is discretionary due to its request for additional floor area than the zoning permits, and also because it's adding 50 or more residential units. So the project will go through discretionary review and is therefore subject to CEQA. In this situation, the project did not qualify for any CEQA exemptions, and so an initial study was prepared. During that initial study preparation, it was determined that there were potentially significant impacts. However, all impacts could be mitigated to less than significant levels with the implementation of mitigation measures. So therefore, a mitigated negative declaration was prepared in this situation. So specifically with this project, the following impacts were able to be mitigated to less than significant levels. Some of those examples were noise impacts that were created by parking ramps of the new building, and public services specific to police protection. These were potential impacts created during the construction phase, specifically related to the security of the construction site. And so for these, mitigation measures were imposed upon the project. Oftentimes for the construction of projects that have garages, we have mitigation measures placed upon them that would reduce the sound of cars as they navigate through a parking structure. And then with regard to security, there may be measures such as additional fencing or lighting that would be applied to the project that would be in place during the construction phase of the project. So in addition to that, and outside beyond mitigation measures, the project would be subject to our building code and any applicable LA Green Building Code requirements, such as with the previous examples. Remember that these standards are universally applied to projects seeking a building permit within the city of LA. So beyond the entitlement process and any imposition of conditions that would be required of the project, the applicant or the builder would still be required to go through building and safety and be subject to any existing safeguards that we have as they relate to the construction and occupancy of this type of building. Okay. So moving on to our next scenario, scenario 4. So with this project, a proposed project is seeking a tract map and a zone change that's comprised of 3 7-story buildings, including a hotel, student housing, and mixed income housing components. So the question is, what kind of environmental review process would this project undergo? Okay, so we'll give a little time. This one has a little more components to it than the previous examples. So just to restate, this is a project that includes 3 7-story buildings, including a hotel, student housing, and mixed income housing components, and did involve a request for a zone change. Getting ready to close up the poll. The environmental impact category is popular, environmental impact report. So correct, this project was subject to environmental impact report. It was a discretionary case. It did not qualify for any CEQA exemptions, and so an initial study was prepared. During that process, the project was found to result in significant and unavoidable impacts. Specifically, the following impact categories were identified: aesthetics, specific to views, light, glare, and shading; air quality, cultural resources; energy, geology and soils; greenhouse gas emissions; hazards and hazardous materials; land use, noise, public services; transportation; tribal cultural resources; and utilities and service systems. So because this project was deemed to have significant environmental impacts, even after the identification of feasible mitigation measures, a statement of overriding consideration was also prepared, which, as we explained previously in the presentation, this statement of overriding consideration explains why further mitigation measures are not feasible and why the approval of the project with significant but unavoidable impacts is warranted. So oftentimes this statement will reflect an ultimate balance of competing benefits of the project, such as economic or social benefits, against its potential significant impacts on the environment. And also, just going back to with the previous examples, the project would also be subject to our LA Green Building Code because it would result in new residential and non-residential buildings. And just again, reiterating the fact that these are standards that are universally applied. And so anyone that's coming into our building, our Department of Building and Safety, requesting a new building permit would be subject to these standards. Okay, we have one more scenario for everyone. Scenario 5. The Department of City Planning is updating a community plan which includes goals, objectives, and policies, as well as amendments and changes to the land use map and the corresponding zones. This would affect what types of developments are considered to be by right in the future. Zoning changes could result in up to 43,000 in additional population over a 20-year period. So just like the others, what kind of environmental review process would this project undergo? And again, just to go over that, this is this speaks to more of a policy document. This is an update to one of our city's 35 community plans. So we'll keep the poll open just for a little bit longer. It looks like just about half of everyone has responded. Okay, so the results are in. Interesting. So it looks like we have just over 50% of folks stating that this project would warrant an environmental impact report. And then the next in line would be that it's not a project under CEQA. So let's talk about that a little bit. The community plan update process is a discretionary action, and so it is therefore subject to CEQA. So it in fact is surely not exempt from CEQA. And we would undergo an environmental review process. With this scenario, the plan update identifies substantial changes to the future physical environment of the community. While some impacts could be reduced to less than significant levels with mitigation, Some proposed changes to the plan would result in significant and unavoidable impacts. And so for these reasons, the environmental impact report was prepared. So some examples of mitigation measures that could potentially reduce identified impacts to less than significant levels would be, for example, establishing best practices regarding archaeological and paleontological resources on construction sites, or searching databases for historic uses of hazardous materials on construction sites. Others where we have significant and unavoidable impacts would be areas such as shade and shadow impacts on certain uses, or temporary construction-related air quality emissions and noise, and potentially the use of parks and recreational facilities. As we mentioned with the example, this is a project, or this plan update could result in potentially 43,000 additional population numbers for this particular community plan area. And so going back to the poll results, quite a few of you said that the project or this community plan update would not be subject to CEQA. And so I think what that speaks to is what the community plan update process does is establish where zoning, where the city and the department would like to see growth, and where we would establish by right capacity within a community area. So for example, if we rezoned a parcel to allow multifamily housing, and a person subsequently came in and requested a permit for, a fairly modest sized apartment building that was by right, that would be by right and would be not subject to CEQA review. But the policy document that would enact that ability to be a by right project would in fact be subject to CEQA review. And so that would result in an EIR process. And we just want to kind of go back to the handout that we have available for you. The EIR process does have a number of opportunities for you to get involved in providing feedback or comments for staff. So one of the first stages is the scoping meeting, followed by the comment period once the draft EIR is released. And so while we encourage everyone to get involved throughout the life and the process, the development of an EIR, those are two of the key moments where we're especially looking for feedback from the public. And with that, we did want to highlight and take the opportunity to highlight the fact that our city is currently undergoing an update to 16 of our 35 community plans. And so those are all in various stages of the update process. Some are getting ready to initiate the EIR process. Some have recently had scoping meetings. And so we do want to reiterate the fact that, we encourage people to get involved with this process. And so that wraps up our scenarios. I'll hand it back over to Dylan.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Jenna, for leading us through these scenarios and teaching us even more about how we can apply what we learned here today. And with that, we'll conclude today's Planning 101, Planning for the Environment webinar. Thank you for your participation. On the screen now are also ways that you can keep in touch with the Department of City Planning. This includes the contact information for all 3 community liaisons who can be your direct links to the department. We are also on many social media outlets, which are all great ways to stay up to date on a daily basis with our work. A recording of this webinar and videos of past Planning 101 trainings are accessible on our YouTube channel, which is linked via our website at planning.lacity.org. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.